Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this exciting session on genomics. My name is Ruben, and I'm with the investment team at Pi Ventures and a volunteer at India Deep Tech. So let me begin with an overview of India Deep Tech. So India Deep Tech is an initiative or sort of like an alliance by a bunch of entrepreneurs, investors, corporates, incubators, and industry experts who've come in together with one goal, which is to make India a deep tech hub. And we feel that there is a good momentum as far as India is concerned. And there are some success stories, but there's still lots to be done. And this is one of the ways that we can, propel India to the next orbit. So the idea is to create a vibrant community which can encourage each other, inspire each other, and also help each other out. Over the last 6 months or so since the formalization, there have been a bunch of initiatives that have been taken by India Deep Tech and panel discussions focused on specific topics being one of them. The plan is also to launch an accelerator sometime early next year. And yeah, so if this is something that excites you guys, if this is something that is of interest, we can share an invite for WhatsApp group so that you can stay abreast with what's happening and contribute in whatever way possible. So that being said, I think without further ado, would love to introduce Dr. Chandru, who really doesn't need an introduction, but let me still give a brief one. So Dr. Chandru is a pioneer in the life sciences space in India. He's the founder and director at Strand Life Sciences. And over his illustrious career, which spans 2-3 decades, he's won multiple national as well as international awards for innovation, as well as his contribution to life sciences sector. He's an alum of BIS Pilani, UCLA, and MIT. And we're really, really glad to have you here, Dr. Chandru. And thanks for agreeing to chair the session. Over to you.
Thank you, Rupan, and thank you. Well, thank you for
Thanks, Doctor.
letting me do this, and of course, genomics and unlocking the potential of genomics is the theme that we're going to follow for today's panel as a vertical within sort of the deep tech initiatives. Basically, just to say a word about deep tech itself, I think at the Indian Institute of Science, we've been tallying up all the startups that come out, and an interesting correlation between the startups out of ISC and deep tech as a theme. So I'm very happy to be here as also a representative of the ISC ecosystem. The topic of genomics is, of course, very relevant, both because it is, and therefore we are at a stage now that we with the use of these technologies. So let me try to a little bit more. Flatley's law, as it's called, is the law of how the sequencing costs of genome sequencing has been going down roughly at the square of Moore's law ever since next generation sequencing became possible. And so today, we are within sight of a $100 whole genome, human genome sequencing cost. And I think, of course, Illumina has been driving us towards that, but are going to be several other technologies as well coming into play. We also, have to understand the overall impact of genomics. I think from bioeconomy perspective, some of you recall, I think in 2012 or 13, President Barack Obama, in his address to the nation, proclaimed that the US had made 140 times the investment in genomics. So while the US government had invested about 5.4 um, billion dollars or so at that point, the actual returns were much higher. I'm getting a message that my
Yeah,
audio is breaking, so I'm
Dr.
not
Chandru,
sure how to fix that.
you might want to switch off your video so that we can save some bandwidth at your end.
Just turn off my video for a
Yes,
second,
please. Yeah,
and
thank you.
is that better? Yeah, I just did that. Um, so I think uh, the panel we have today is a really interesting group, and we should probably get on to the panel discussion. We have the venture by Ranjit Menon from Chirate. We have Anand representing Bugworks. We have Anirvan with Haystack, Apti with Arogya, and Kanan with Oncophilnomics, and of course, last but not least, we Debojyoti Debo, who is representing the IGIB group from CSIR, and where they've been doing very interesting work with gene editing. So what I will do is now hand over to each of the panelists and ask them to introduce themselves and also tell us a little bit about what they see with genomics in their individual spaces. So Ranjit, I think maybe we should start with the venture side. So if you could your 5 minutes now and tell us what the Chirute interest in deep tech and genomics is. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Vijay, and thank you very much for having me on this panel. I am with a fund called Chirate Ventures. We're essentially a tech-focused VC fund, been operating in India for the last 13 years or so. We manage close to $800 million in terms of assets, invested in over 90 companies across software, digital consumer, healthcare, fintech spaces. Predominantly early stage, like I said, a bunch of stuff that we do is really Series A and B. We also have a program where we look at very early stage companies, which is about 10% of our capital goes into seed stage investments. Within health, I lead investments in the healthcare space. We've been investing consistently across multiple domains within health. We've invested in medical devices, biotech companies. We've invested in a couple of biomaterials companies, and increasingly the focus has been more and more on digital health platforms, given the nature of the gaps that we're seeing here, the opportunities that we're seeing. But this current fund that we're investing out of has also carved out a separate, investment sector called deep tech. And the reason we do this is we've seen this emergence of these companies that are a little bit more focused on, more pure sciences and engineering-led businesses. I won't say businesses, engineering-led platforms that are not, where the end application is not, very absolutely clear, right? And that's the way we kind of define deep tech internally for us. I mean, these are companies that are more focused on science and engineering than on end applications. And the way we think about these businesses, and the reason we carved out this separately, was that we believe that these kind of businesses, take longer in terms of their gestation period, given that the technology that they're developing are possibly ahead of its time. Business models are absolutely not clear. Revenue models are still far away. So it takes a little bit longer in terms of coming out. But more importantly, there is significant investment that is required in core R&D in these sectors. The IP portfolio and so on and so forth becomes so much more critical as against to the revenue milestones, which is what typical VCs would tend to look at, right? I mean, you're looking at very large markets, very fast growth rates. Those are the kind of companies that kind of continuously raise large amounts of capital, but this is a sector which we believe is slow in terms of its growth prospects, longer term in terms of gestation, and more focused on core science and technology. So there is a clear carve out from our fund to focus, and we believe genomics also would fall in this space. And I must tell you that we've not done much in that space as we speak, but it's a space that we would want to spend some time. As of now, few companies that we've funded in this space would include a company that is putting together a bionic arm, bringing about a combination of artificial intelligence and human kinematics, right, to actually develop a human arm. We've invested in a company that is kind of developing colors, stressing bacteria to generate colors. We're looking at a nanomaterial company focused on antimicrobial products. So a bunch of these companies, which is really rooted more in science and engineering, is the focus area. Now, again, I mean, coming specifically to genomics, like I said, I mean, I'm not an authority here, given the folks are on the panel, but I think the way we kind of look at this space is that, I mean, there are multiple areas even within genomics, right? Whether it's applied genomics, whether it is services, lab services that are associated with it. But I think one area that we are specifically looking at that we think would be very interesting for a fund like ours is more the enabling technologies to drive genomics forward. This could be whether it's in terms of medical, I mean, small devices, instruments, reagents, and more platform technologies that kind of enable this. So I think that is one area that we are specifically looking at within the gambit of genomics as we see it, and also in the broader concept of deep tech at a fund level. So that's an area, and we continue to look out for companies, and we'll be happy to work with anybody who are in that particular space and see how we can take it forward.
Sorry, Vijay, we're not able to hear you.
Sorry. Yeah. I just switched devices because I was having a problem with the connectivity. So thank you, Ranjit. I think we'll come back to some Q&A later, but let's move on to Anand. Anand is, of course, with Bugworks, and would like to also lay out some of the early foundational work that led to Bugworks, which was definitely rooted in genomics. And plus, just like to ask him to say a couple of words also about the fact that Bugworks has been set up as a US entity, and what he might think we need in the ecosystem here to match what the US offers. Yeah. So please.
Great. Thank you very much, Vijay, for this opportunity, and to the organizers for having me. I'm Anand from Bugworks, and Vijay's company, Strand, was a pioneer in this space and one of the inspirations for us doing CellWorks in 2007, 2008. Genomics very exciting space in India because it allowed for information technology, mathematics, computer science, and biology to come together. Folks like Vijay and myself used to talk about this convergence in the early 2000s, but with genomics, that convergence of information technology and biotechnology actually happened. So we're quite thankful for it. And from there, many of these crossover technologies happen. So in CellWorks, what we did was as follows. We created probably one of the largest pathway map of cancer. Basically, the biochemistry of cancer, whatever has been mapped so far, has been stitched together using complex differential equations over all of these years. It's probably one of the largest genomics and proteomics map. And using that map, we are working with leading oncology companies all over the world to predict responses to standard of care drugs, as well as come out with potentially new therapies that are recommended for patients who are not responding to standard of care. So what is the advantage of that? So you have this biochemical mathematical pathway that you create. And top of that, we bring in genomics, FISH, IHC, whole exome, transcriptome, whatever you want. We bring in the genomic information, and the map reorients itself based on the patient genomic information. And then you can run tens of thousands of simulations on the personalized pathway map and come out with the best combinations. So what are the two biggest applications in such a genomic system? One is to work with pharmaceutical companies who are going through clinical trials to identify who may be the right patient strata or patient group on which you can do clinical trials. Very hard to convince pharmaceutical companies to use such a platform technology, and the business was not easy. The second case is clinical groups, particularly in the United States, who adopt these methods, who are very curious to know why their patients are only getting 20% response rate, 30% response rate. Are there platform technologies that can improve that by even another 10%, moved from 30 to 40 or 25 to 35? And then there are insurance companies who are saying, I'm spending $100,000 per patient per year, $100,000 with a 20% outcome. Can I have something that can improve that outcome from a 20 to 30%? That's why we are invested in by United Healthcare, which is one of the largest insurance companies in the world, who are now integrating CellWorks platform into their oncology business practice to say, let's keep our costs down by getting better outcomes. The biggest challenge in the genomics business is the follows. Nobody will accept your technology if you don't have clinical trials. So we started the company in 2007, now it's 13, 14 years. Has been phenomenal scientific pioneering work, but the business has not been easy. That's just the humbling fact. And now finally, we have tied up with Foundation Medicine in the US, who are using this platform to do the whole genome sequencing and then come up with these predictive analysis that they can upsell to their customers. So you only have two customers, either the oncologists or companies like Illumina and Foundation Medicine, who can take the genomic platform and upsell their genome sequencing business. Tough business, but exemplary. And when Vijay's company or CellWorks tried to do this, the cost of sequencing was ridiculous. And thankfully, Flatley's law took over, which is much better than Moore's law in semiconductors. And today we are here. Moving from CellWorks, we spun out BugWorks. BugWorks is a drug discovery company aimed at solving superbugs. We don't use genomics, but because this is a deep tech seminar, I should just spend 2 minutes on it, right? We use amazing set of mathematical simulation tools that are molecular dynamics, Stardrop, Schrodinger, that use a heavy duty biophysics and mathematics to simulate how the bacterial efflux pump looks like, to simulate proteins inside bacteria. And then we're able to dock our compound with these moving proteins and look at how to avoid resistance, how to come out with new compounds that can evade resistance intelligence in bacteria. So heavy duty biophysics tools. And Vijay, probably you'll be intrigued to know that now we are bringing AI ML on top of it to do predictive analysis. And our antiviral program is completely based on AI ML. We just use 108 antiviral compounds to train a system, which is a complex neural net system. And then we took 1,000 compounds, and from 1,000 compounds, we got 100 hits through this AI ML program as antivirals. And when we synthesized those 100, we got 6 real hits. So it's really not bad. 1,000 to 100 to a 6 in a matter of 3 months, right? So very, very exciting things. My last point, very important question that Vijay asked is, It is extremely difficult to do a life sciences company from India. There are very few charities. There are very few access. We simply don't have the capital here. The ecosystem is actually fantastic to do early stage drug discovery, early stage genomics. You have CCAMP, you have BBC, you have IISc, DBT has done a phenomenal job last 10 years. That's all for the early stage work. When you run out of those grants and you run out of those ecosystems and you need Series A, Series B capital, it's headbanging. It really is headbanging. So we set up outside so that we could tap capital in the United States. We could work with the US government for Department of Defense, because we also work on bioterrorism as biodefense solutions. It's very hard. So while I encourage youngsters to do companies, I think genomic type of companies are relatively easier than a drug discovery company, for sure. Still, please think where you're going to raise a capital, Series A, Series B. Look beyond the big grant, the BIRAC grant, to figure out where the capital markets are going to come. I hope in the next 2 to 3 years, this last lacunae in our ecosystem changes to where you have life sciences and deep tech funding. Otherwise, more companies will continue to move out, which means you do all the hard work in India, but the value creation happens outside. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anand. Now let's actually move to a very early stage company. I'd like to invite Prapti Jaiswal from Arogya to please come in and introduce yourself. Of course, you've got a really great video on your website. I encourage the audience to go and check that out. But you could also tell us a little bit about what Arogya AI is all about. Right? Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the opportunity and want to thank the organizers at the outset. It's a privilege to be in the company of such stalwarts in the ecosystem. And Anand is a hard act to follow, but I'll really try my best. Arogya AI provides precision medicine for antimicrobial resistance. And it all started for me as the starry-eyed pupil who started her PhD at the Translational Health Science and Technology Institute, where Professor M.K. Bhan, for the first time on a Foundation Day lecture, introduced the concept of translation, which is taking research into real-world application, research from the bench to the bedside. And I transitioned from being a molecular and microbiologist into an entrepreneur at Entrepreneur First. These years of education, I understood TB scientifically and the problems associated with it. But as an entrepreneur, I was able to see the problems through a very different and complex lens. I found myself taking all possible stakeholders in the ecosystem, including TB champions, patients, as well as providers of these services to the TB patients in the entire ecosystem. The bottom line was, it was ridiculous that TB is the most lethal infectious disease globally today. It's a curable disease. There are over 15 drugs and antibiotics that can cure tuberculosis. But the problem is, doctors don't always know which drug works for whom. The emergence of drug resistance, which means that these antibiotics, which are extremely strong, are deemed ineffective in killing these bacteria. So the emergence of drug resistance and its delayed diagnosis has only exacerbated the problem. Now, typically TB patients have to be on combinations of 4 very strong antibiotics for 6 to 9 months. In a best case scenario, they get cured. But if they don't, if they're resistant to these drugs, it's traumatic. These medications, which are really strong, are ineffective, and the side effects are detrimental to the human health. It includes hearing loss, speech defects, kidney, liver toxicity, pigmentation of skin. Bottom line is that patients are going on this ineffective treatment for months, sometimes years, playing a game of trial and error. And Arogya AI puts a stop to that. We marry genomics and artificial intelligence to provide precision diagnosis to enable prescription of effective treatment to these patients. It takes about 2 months to grow Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the causative agents, in the laboratory to figure out whether a patient is resistant or susceptible to the set of drugs that are being administered. Using genomics and artificial intelligence, we can cut down that time to a matter of a few hours. Doctors will no longer have to empirically prescribe medication. Now, the bacterial genome is about 4.5 million base pairs. That's a wealth of information that we haven't unlocked yet. Imagine it as a 14,000 page book, just text of 14,000 pages. But it needs to be made sense of. And that's where we translate all of this research into real world use. We align, annotate these genomes, put commas and punctuation, read it to make sense to figure out which drugs will work for which patient in order to kill that bacteria. With continuous learning and machine learning, the algorithm itself evolves with each patient that comes through the system. We intend to monetize the test and also the entire proprietary database that we're able to generate. Like Anand mentioned, the numbers in India are unfortunately or fortunately, it depends on whether you see it as a public health problem or as a business problem. We have no dearth of numbers in India. There are 13,000 presumptive TB cases today. And we need to basically capitalize on all of this information. We've already built our prototype on a few hundred data points and are currently validating it in the clinical context. We're part of the Illumina Accelerator program at San Francisco. We had 6 months working with those guys. We get sequencing credits and monthly check-ins with Mustafa, who's the CTO there. The infectious disease team and the technical team has helped us streamline our technical and business strategies and open doors for us globally, for funding opportunities, for collaborating opportunities, and for business opportunities. We've also been backed by the Ministry of Health last week for our Healthcare Innovation Award. We're backed by GE Healthcare in the ecosystem, by RACTI, and it's definitely heartening the support that there is in the ecosystem. But we always want more. There's always scope to ask for more. We've been playing catch up with these bugs for too long, and it's time to unlock our human technological prowess to start staying ahead in the game with these bugs. And that's the only way we can win. That's all about Arogya AI. You're on mute, Vijay.
Yeah. No, I got it. Thank you for that quick introduction. As you pointed out that you're about a few hundred, sort of tests into building your training set, so to speak, for the machine learning. What is the roadmap? How soon are you planning to get? I think you mentioned about 5,000 as being sort of the goal where you should be able to get good predictive power, right? And so how long do you feel you'll take to get there?
Yeah, so we're seeing good numbers at a much lower number than 5,000. That was a theoretical thing that we thought right at the beginning, but when we started building it, we were starting to see very promising numbers at 1,000, 2,000. We're there at that point. Right. We need to make clinical validations. We see hopefully in the next 3 months, but hopefully no more COVID delays, and we can make this happen because the entire TB system has been hijacked by COVID. Thank you.
Yeah. So good luck, and thank you, Prapti. So just to get a completely different focus, I'd like to move to oncophenomics and request Dr. Kannan to talk to us now about the very interesting work that they're doing with liquid biopsy. Again, we'd like to know how far along you are with actually treating patients, and both for monitoring and for screening applications.
Yes, so, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I'm really glad to be participating in this forum today. And Oncophenomics has been a very long journey for me, almost 5 years. So I came back in 2012 working in Novartis, then worked in a couple of diagnostic centers. So I was doing one CME for Apollo oncologist. So this was way back in 2015, almost 5 years ago. So that time the doctors are asking, what is this liquid biopsy? When can our patients in India can get this access to this test? So that time MedGenome or nobody has started, even Standard not started the liquid biopsy way back in 2015. I guess you guys started in 2017 or later. So it was too early at that point of time. So I thought, okay, the market is ready. Let me do know that in a startup and entrepreneurial, the leap of faith. I thought, okay, we'll have an early mover advantage, but later on we realized it's a very long journey. So it's not, it's easier said than done. So we struggled initially to raise funds. So luckily we went through the ET Power of Ideas and the CIE from IIM Ahmedabad. So they supported us in the pre-seed round. Then we were lucky to get the BAG grant. So BIRAC was a huge boost for us. We set up the lab in IKP, Genome Valley. Then later on we moved to CCMB. So the past 3 years we have been in CCMB. So we actually completed our incubation, and now we actually graduated and we moved out of Atal Incubation Center, and we set up an NABL lab now. So because of COVID, there was a delay, but now we are now ready to offer our liquid biopsy services under the NABL umbrella. But eventually, what we want to see is we want to see a decentralized model. So we are actually building a device, a lab on a chip device. This is mainly for the circulating tumor cells. And so right now, there's no companies offering the CTC test in India. Most of the CTC tests are outsourced. They either go to Taiwan or Singapore, or they send it to Centogene or some other companies in the US. Quest Diagnostics used to operate from Delhi. So right now, doctors are not using CTC tests routinely in the lab, in the clinic. They mainly order the cell-free DNA test. So when you say liquid biopsy, everybody thinks about cell-free DNA. But there are 3 types of liquid biopsy. So first is the actual cancer cells running around in the blood, the CTCs. Then we have the cell-free DNA, which comes from the dead cells. So this is what I keep telling my investors. CTCs are the live cells, which are going to come back later and give trouble. They are the ones that cause the cancer recurrence or the metastasis. So I'm more worried about the CTCs than about the cell-free DNA. Cell-free DNA is useful as a treatment monitoring tool because as soon as you give chemotherapy, the drugs are going to kill the cancer cells and the DNA comes into the blood. So we can see a sudden spike in the cfDNA concentration, also tumor-specific mutations. We can track them. We can even do the clonal tracking in the cfDNA. cfDNA has plenty of use cases in lung cancer, breast cancer, and it's already part of the protocol, the NCC and ESMO guidelines. But CTC is very limited applications right now. So we want to take CTCs into mainstream, into the clinical domain. We want to offer to everybody. So right now, patients can take advantage of our clinical trials. So we're working with Narayana Health. We're working with AAG hospitals. A couple of colorectal cancer studies are going on. We completed one pancreatic cancer study. So right now, we are focusing mainly on the epigenetics. So people usually do DNA sequencing. But for epigenetics, you have to do like bisulfite sequencing or some other techniques. So that's why we switched from Illumina into Nanopore. So all our NGS panels are now built on top of Nanopore sequencing. So the raw data we can analyze in a different pipeline. Then we can also see the methylation. So 5MC and 5HMC, some of the common this kind of epigenetic changes. We can look at this methylation, the CpG islands and the methylation profiles, very interesting data. Also mitochondrial DNA. So people usually ignore the mitochondrial DNA. So a lot of interesting things about mitochondrial DNA. And protein work we have not done. So mainly looking at the cellular level, DNA level. The third is the exosomes. So exosomes, we are still at a very early stage, but very soon we'll be launching exosomes. So in exosomes, we will be doing the RNA isolation. So we have developed a unique exosome isolation platform. So this is on the lab on a chip technology. So our CTC platform is that's our flagship product, the Oncophenomics. The fluidics is the microfluidics components. So this is where we see a decentralized approach. These devices can be deployed in all the cancer hospitals, and samples can be processed then and there. The data will come on the cloud. So then we can have a centralized, we can have molecular biologists and pathologists reviewing the data from a centralized location. So truly enabling telemedicine or telepathology kind of solutions. So we're also doing the digital pathology. So when you do liquid biopsy, you have to correlate with other tests. So you have to look at the CT scans, PET CT, the MRI, and you also need to look at the tissue biopsy because 1 year ago, patient had a tissue biopsy. So we have to see what was the biomarker status. Since we are mainly focusing on breast cancer and ovarian cancer, we mainly look at all the ER, PR, HER2, this kind of status, biomarker status. Maybe the tumor was initially HER2 positive, but the CTCs are HER2 negative. But the doctors keep on giving them HER2 targeted therapies. It won't work because the new cells that are running around in the blood are now, they emerged, they phenotypically, they changed. So this is what we are trying to address. Over a period of time, the phenotypes keep changing. So we are trying to see if we can identify the emerging drug resistant phenotypes. So that is the main use case for this technology. Sorry, I think you're on mute, sir.
Yeah, sorry. So if you could also tell us a little bit about what you're doing with other types of liquid samples, like with urine. I think you're also looking at urine.
Yes,
and,
yes.
Whether there's some good map to looking at
Definitely.
saliva and
yes. So we are not restricted to blood samples. We have done a couple of samples. For example, in lung cancer patients, biopsies are very difficult. So we usually collect the pleural effusion, the fluid. So the doctors regularly, whenever there's a fluid accumulation, they tap it out. So instead of discarding that fluid, we can check the fluid. So we have found the cancer cells detected in the fluid. Similarly, in cases of ovarian cancer, we have had a couple of cases where they're given us the ascites fluid from the peritoneal cavity. So any biological fluid, our platform is able to, it's basically a rare cell enrichment device. It can capture the cells, very easy to isolate them. So oncology is not the only use case. So we are also envisioning reproductive medicine, finding the fetal cells in the maternal blood or something like that. So we're also exploring other areas.
Right. Do you see a potential for this to really become a large-scale screening platform for public health?
Yes. So the selfie DNA is easy. It's easy to deploy as a screening tool. In case of CTCs, in the early stage cancers like stage 1 or 2, you will never see CTCs. Only when the cancer becomes aggressive, it leaves the primary location, then it starts spreading to other parts of the body. So typically late stage 2 or early stage 3, that's the earliest we can see CTCs. And there are certain cancers, there have been no publications about CTCs. So breast cancer is very popular, and lung cancer, prostate and colon. But for example, renal cell carcinoma and certain other cancers, thyroid cancers, there are not many papers on evidence of CTCs in those scenarios. So that's why people went to cfDNA, because that's universal. It's for everybody, all the cancers.
Right. Yeah. So thank you very much, Kannan. I think great work, and obviously the future of cancer treatment is really in early and better detection and diagnosis. And I think you're on the right track there. I think there were some questions about the name of your company. Just to repeat, it's OncoPhenomics. You were called Theranostics at one point, but I think you're now...
So we started as Theranosis in India, then later on we changed into OncoPhenomics.
Okay, right. Okay, very good. And so now let's move on. I'm leaving Dr. Debajyoti from IGIB for a particular reason. I'd like to ask Anirban Chatterjee to tell us about Haystack. And in some ways, you're also looking at TB and drug resistance, and similar to what Prapti talked about. Perhaps you can tell us how you're different and what the deep tech involved is, and on the computational side, right? Yeah, please.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Chandru, for this, and also thanks to the organizers. This is a very august panel, and I'm kind of I have sweaty palms after what Anand, Prapti, and Kannan has said. But I think it's fair that I go back and probably talk about the journey of a researcher and how I have traveled this journey of tuberculosis, which started actually. Way back during my master's when I was doing work at Lupin Pharmaceuticals, where it was all about microbiology and molecular biology, doing MICs and efficacy assays for the new MDR-TB drug. And that was all fine, hundreds and thousands of plates and everything. But then by the time I started my PhD, it just became much bigger and wilder, where I was kind of genotyping thousands and thousands of clinical TB samples. And we ended up deciphering how tuberculosis acquires drug resistance, the molecular epidemiology of drug resistance. And these were one of the first few insights as to how a patient can go from drug susceptible to drug resistant despite having a compliant therapy. The acquisition of drug resistance and amplification of drug resistance. This was phenomenal. And more importantly, my PhD was over. I think that was a greater relief for me. By the time I reached for my postdoc at Oxford, at John Radcliffe Hospital, we figured that whatever I had done in my PhD was practically obsolete, because whole genome sequencing can replace all of that. And we very quickly realized that genomics is the only way forward for TB diagnosis. And we started building the entire computing and the patient care architecture that can replace it for the NHS UK. What started as a simple scientific project ended up being taken up by the NHS UK. So UK has been doing genomics for TB since 2015 as a result of the work that we did in Oxford. And obviously, several studies later, which started after that, the WHO has already released the complete guidelines for genomic-based TB diagnostics. What are the mutations, and how do we go from here? While I was still doing that, I was still kind of in research mode, working on other pathogens. I was discovering new viruses. I named few of them Mimivirus Bombay and Bandra and Kurla for a lack of a better name. And I was tracking antimicrobial resistance purely using genomics and absolutely no culture and molecular tests. And this was phenomenal for me because in 2005, I was doing antimicrobial resistance on micro-agar dilution methods. And by 2017, I did not even bother to culture the bacteria or virus. We were just doing genomics and being able to find out how drug resistance evolves. We ended up sequencing close to tens and thousands of genomes from very complicated sample. In fact, our TB platform itself, which is live now, we have already sequenced and analyzed more than 10,000 TB whole genomes globally, and about 5,500, 6,000 from India already. So this is where Haystack started. And we had a clear vision that we wanted to scale genomics for diagnostics for all infectious diseases using culture-free genomics. Of course, when we do this, we do know that we are going to disrupt the entire diagnostic paradigm of communicable diseases, where a single diagnostic test will not only enable detection, a comprehensive diagnostics for deciding the exact therapy, but also while we are doing it, it will give us real-time disease mapping, discovering new pathogens, giving us the unique opportunity to detect potentially highly infectious transmissible species of viruses and bacteria along the way. We had already launched TB with the capability to test every TB antibiotics in about 15 minutes. We launched this after validation with the Central TB Division. And then with a shot in the arm from Department of Science and Technology, we are now ready to launch for COVID around our genomic transmission work that we have already done in COVID. Underlying all of this is the success that we have received in less than a year is my experience of scaling up genomics in UK and Denmark. In UK, we ended up doing like 30,000 odd genomes for TB. In Denmark, we're looking at 100,000 infectious disease sewage samples from all over the world. And at Haystack, we started building on those concepts to be applicable not only in those markets, but also in nascent and resource-limited settings such as India. And this is where the most important issue of computing comes in. We need to imagine what is scale and what scale lies ahead of us once genomics becomes more and more population scale. The innovation is not only about how to develop it, but how to sustain it. So for example, we need to change the way we infer genomic data. In case of inferencing, we need to move forward from the legacy, GWAS studies. The tremendous improvement that we have now with Bayesian models, graphs, neural networks, it gives us the potential in a way to inference population genomics data never before done. At the core of it all, we are going back to the oldest genetics of all, and that is phylogenetics. By exploiting the ever-increasing multi-threaded computational architectures with neural networks, we are now able to scan phylogenetic trees with more than 1 million nodes and creating decision matrices for core outcomes, including DNA-protein interactions, drug DNA interactions, and even epistasis. In simple words, for the first time, we have the ability to decouple from phenotype-based annotation to pure genetic network-based annotation. This is creating the greatest disruption in the use of population scale data for not only drug discovery, but also basic biological discovery of structure and function. At Haystack, we have created this platform which automates genomic discovery and genomic inferencing with the tremendous potential of nonlinear scaling. We are agnostic to sequencing technology. Our platform now works with Illumina BGI and Oxford Nanopore, and we can't wait for newer technologies coming out of Genopsys, Genapsys, and others on the way DNA is sequenced. We think this is the platform which will create value not only on the inferencing side, but on an automated clinical decision side for every sequencer, whether it's in a sequencing company or whether it's in a lab. And we want to enable all of them. We want to make this platform available, plug and play, so that everybody can do genomics just the way I was doing it at Oxford.
Very good. Sounds very exciting. And I guess, so you're all set up with a full metagenomics platform. Is that
yes.
Basically what you were saying, that
yes,
that you could actually look at all the pathogens
yes.
Through that.
Yes.
Just wanted to point out that there's a very nice emerging field of genomic epidemiology, of course.
Yes, yes.
And Chitra Pattabhiraman here at NIMHANS did some very nice work with COVID.
Yes.
Where she could actually trace which parts of Karnataka got which strain of the SARS-CoV-2 virus,
yes.
and in some ways that could be very helpful also to see how the transmission is going. So that would be another dimension to
Absolutely.
sort of add to your capabilities. And speaking of COVID, I think it'll take us to our last panelist. I think having a panelist who's actually representing a CSIR lab, I think is actually a really good choice of representations in a discussion like this. And I would like to thank the organizers for being supportive on this. And Debajyoti Chakravarti is, of course, been in the news a fair amount very recently because of the extraordinary speed with which they were able to bring out a CRISPR-Cas9 based diagnostic test called Feluda internally. I think now that it's moved out commercially, it's probably got a different branding with the Tata Health Group. So I'd like him to talk to us about that handoff and how deep tech is really prospers in societies where this translation from academic and research settings to the commercial world happens in a seamless way. And I think with Feluda, we saw that happening with alacrity, right? Incredibly timely sort of translation. And so Debo, would love to hear you tell us a little bit about that. But also do tell us about the Chakrabarti lab at IGIB and the work you're doing on gene therapy for sickle cell disease, and which I think has enormous impact and application as well. Yeah. So Debo, over to you. Yeah.
Thanks, Vijay. I'm really feeling like an outlier in this in this group, but it's very nice that you kind of finally blended everything.
So when are you becoming an entrepreneur? Right?
Well, I'm seriously considering. So yeah, it's a great eye opener for me. Yeah. So yeah, I'm really happy that I get a chance today to speak a little bit. I come from molecular biology background, and my work is very recent. So I have joined IGIB only in 2016. So I have a 4-year-old lab. So that way. And I'll just tell you a little bit briefly about what we do, because that will help you understand how we transitioned into CRISPR diagnostics and why Feluda and how it all happened. Is because we started working on something called a CSIR sickle cell mission. One of the pet projects of our prime minister at that point of time was to come up with the ideas to tackle the sickle cell problem. It's a huge problem, actually. Some of us are probably not aware of it, but India is home to more than 50% of the carriers of sickle cell anemia across the world. So that's a big number. It's there in the tribal belts, it's there in pockets, it's there in massive areas in Chhattisgarh, in Tripura, in Maharashtra, and so on. And unfortunately, there are two issues with sickle cell. One is that carrier individual screening, where sequencing comes up as a big help in some cases, but it's also not something that is a point of care kind of a diagnostics. The point of care generally is based on protein markers and some crude tests called solubility tests, which are being done in screening camps. They provide some information, but often are not very accurate and require follow-up studies and so on. And the other thing is, of course, curing the disease. We would have never thought about curing diseases till, of course, genome editing came in, and the possibilities of genome editing. I think if you look at a paper that came out in New England Journal of Medicine just this week itself, talking about the excellent initial feedback from the CRISPR trials on sickle cell anemia and beta hemoglobinopathies. That is really, it's very promising as to how this field is going. And if you ask me, in the next 4 or 5 years, starting with one of these blood disorders, going to certain eye disorders, we would have a cure for these permanent cures that we are talking about. If we are lucky, we might even have something for myogenic disabilities. So we started on this, and in the beginning, what our objective was to actually try and see if we can bring in gene editing in some way as a research setup, and try to have some proof of concept to see if you use the CRISPR technology in Indian patient-derived cells, can you cure that? This is early in 2017, before the first papers came in. And we also, at that point of time, we kind of to be very honest, this is work done by both me and Dr. Shobik Maiti from CSR IGIB. We had been looking at this problem in a long-term way, that if we if we show this in the lab, that we can edit the genome, we can correct the mutation, do we really want to stop there and say that yes, our academic involvement is over with the project? What happens after that? And partly because of that, and also partly because the sickle cell mission mode project was actually determined to be not an academic initiative, but rather something which would be possibly showing some directions at translation. So we were very generously funded, and that's one of the cornerstones of any kind of let's say, I would say, a little bit of success in terms of scientific ventures, is that you need to have that confidence and backup from the regulators as well as the funders. What we were able to do in the process is that we were able to understand not only that yes, we can use CRISPR for correcting the genetic disease, but also to build a set of how to say, intellectual property around it. And here I'm talking about probably one of the most hard fought, patent battles that has been there in biology, where you are talking about the CRISPR patent. And the CRISPR patent is, is a holy grail. And there are two big universities or institutes who are fighting over it. And to come in any format there is very difficult. We still have not, but we made advancements towards it. And of course, in the public domain, you can see that we have developed a type of Cas9, which or not, let's not develop. We kind of characterized extensively a Cas9 from a different bacteria, which is not the traditional bacteria which is being used for genome editing and trials, from Streptococcus pyogenes and its advanced variations. But we used a different bacteria called Francisella novicida. I will not go into details why we did that. It was totally serendipitous, no IQ there at all. It was just we wanted something else and we got something else, to be very honest. So we got that, and then we developed very good collaborations with some pioneers in this field, and were able to at this point of time to change it significantly, where we think that we can actually go for having some IP to go ahead in. This is all unpublished, and we are figuring out the modalities there. The other thing that we did is that we realized that not only can this particular Cas protein be used for genome editing, which is correcting the mutation, but we can actually take help of certain properties of this enzyme, in which it distinguishes between two pieces of DNA or RNA by a single nucleotide. So that is almost saying that you can distinguish a point mutation. And immediately, when you think about distinguishing a point mutation using a protein interacting with a DNA piece, the portfolio becomes immense, because point mutations are there everywhere. Point mutations are generally being characterized by sequencing, but here you do not need a sequencing. You basically need to know that sequence with which you want to find the mutation, and you need to have a Cas9 which should be robust enough to have the same readout every single time. It should not be dependent on the DNA sequence of that matter, or let's say of the disease gene or the mutation. So it should work whether it is MDR-TB, it should work if it's Helicobacter pylori infection, it should work if it's case of sickle cell anemia, and it should also work in the case of SARS-CoV-2, which is what we saw. So we did some bit of biology and chemistry to figure out what exactly causes this discrimination, and was able to identify this, how to make a system which is robust enough to every single time distinguish a point mutation. And we termed it Feluda at that point of time. It has an acronym, is FN-Cas9 editor linked uniform detection assay, that happens when you have two Bengalis in a group. And also because the other complementary technologies were called Sherlock and Detector. Sherlock, of course, is from MIT, Detector from California, Berkeley, and there's also Holmes, So the inspiration for naming it in the form of a detective was always there. And we called it, and at the beginning of this year, we were mainly doing Feluda in Raipur, in villages, in a village in Raipur, trying to see if you can actually do this on the field. Take a patient. We saw that kids were coming in a primary healthcare center and having blood pricks, taking blood from their samples, doing a coagulation test. And we figured out that if you want to really go to kids, this is not a very attractive venture. What about allowing them to simply spit into a small tube, and the tube contains these are molecular biology 101. You would have stuff which will break open the cells, DNA comes out, Feluda reaction goes in. Cut a long story short, everything can be done in a single tube, where you have help of isothermal PCR, so no PCR machine required, CRISPR reagents all together, and then the readout is dependent upon how you want to do it. It could be a lateral flow where you have a band on the strip. It could be a fluorescence detection, several different modalities. That's what we so this was in Jan-Feb when the team was there in Raipur, and then of course we read an article in Hindu then that the first case of COVID-19 has not yet been detected in India, but it is supposed to be a pandemic. So we quickly assembled all these students together and said, look, if you really want to make kind of see a technology being useful in a real sense, because a lot of technologies work in the lab, how do you really go to the next stage? This is an opportunity. So let us, start getting the viral genome sequence out. I'm glad to be working in IGIB, because we're churning out sequences on a regular basis, and exactly what are the mutations, what are the sequences to take care of, and so on. And by March, we had of course, I mean, everybody now knows Dr. Anurag's push and the contribution behind all these things, how well he has been putting people together. I think one of the first cases of COVID-19 that was reported in Delhi, we could get hold of that sample, validate it, file a patent, move ahead, get the prototypes in April. And in May, I think there were a bunch of companies that came over and showed expressed interest when we put up an EOI. Currently, that number is around 40-45. So of course, Tata MD, Tata Medical and Diagnostics, they were known. It was not even there at that point of time. It was Tata Sons. They came ahead and said that we want to take this technology forward in May. And then the process had to be again kind of reiterated, because now we had to take a lab working protocol into a product which would work every single time. That was the challenge. So you had to have that translator in between, like a Google Translate, who takes the information from the lab and makes it into a format which the company people understand. So they developed a company which is called Tata Medical and Diagnostics, freshly I think launched in July and August. They made factories, they started procuring the items, did multiple tests, got the DCGI clearance in September, October, and last week when they were here, it was almost seeing that your baby has been taken over by someone, because there were people who were absolutely whom I didn't know, but actually doing the Feluda tests with improvements and things which they completely put ahead. So the lesson learned was that it takes of course it takes immense amount of work to push this at that pace that we were trying to do. But I would not stick my head around and say it can be done by an individual or a lab, but rather an entire organization. In this case, the entire CSIR takes the credit. The entire IGIB actually takes the credit for going ahead. And like I said, there were almost 40-45 companies still there. We are talking to a lot of them, venture capitalists from USA. There are of course some advantages that the system offers over existing technologies, and the second version, or the third version I might say, which we want to come up quickly, where you can potentially do these things closer to home or even at home, which would be completely instrument free. So yeah, that's where we are seeing.
So thank you very much for taking us through that journey. And I think there's a lot to be learned and hopefully emulated by many of our CSIR labs, academic institutions, and so on. By and large, the emotional IQ of the scientific community through this pandemic has been extraordinary to witness. And, and I think lots of very nice deep tech ideas have been taken forward, and but none with the speed and impact comparable to Feluda. So again, congratulations. I think at this point, I'd like to hand it back to Rupan to see if there are some questions from the audience that we can take to the panelists. I'd like to open it up now. Right, thank you.
Yes, Dr. Chandu, thanks for that. So we do see two questions here. One is from Siddharth Jain, and his question is, what is the impact of high cost of regulatory compliances like manufacturing license as per Indian Medical Device Rule 2017 C certifications to startups? Anand, would you like to take that?
Yeah.
Actually, we outsource a lot of our work outside. I may not be the right person for that question. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Maybe Debrajyoti or Prapti.
Yeah, maybe I can add some pointers here.
Please go ahead.
So basically, what many people don't realize, a lot of the academia labs, many of my friends got the BAG grant, some kind of funding from BIRAC. Then they come up with a product, and then they go for clinical trials without even informing CDSCO. So there's a flow chart, there's a step-by-step process. So I highly recommend you hire a regulatory consultant, and first thing you have to do is to get a test manufacturing license, and then you register with ICMR, and you get the permissions to do the clinical trial. So we are currently in that process right now. So after completing the clinical trials, then you submit this data to CDSCO, then you go for a full manufacturing license. But at that point of time, either you should have your own manufacturing plant, or you either lease it or rent it, or you partner with somebody. So that's what we are doing. We are partnering with another company who already have a CDSCO approved manufacturing plant to set up our device. And one of the ISO things that you need if it's a medical device is ISO 13485. And there could be other guidelines that you have to follow. There could be WHO guidelines, CGMP guidelines, and there's a very elaborate detailed information is available on CDSCO website. So it's a pretty straightforward process, but there's a clear-cut timeline. So you have to know what comes first, what comes later. So it's better to work with the regulatory agency.
Right. And I guess, Kannan, you were really talking there about the device side
Yes.
or the test side of things. There is, of course, when you're actually developing something that's more on the therapeutic side, it's a whole different pathway. But
Yes.
the idea of regulatory advice is required there as well. And I'm sorry we didn't really actually get to include. There's a very interesting startup called Hanugen Biotherapeutics in Bangalore, which has actually now gone through that process with a genomic medicine, an antisense oligotherapy for a Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They're actually also ready to work with spinal muscular atrophy. And the antisense oligotherapy, it took them about over a year, but they first got clearance from ICMR to go ahead and do their first inpatient study.
Yes.
And then they've had to go through the whole approval with the Drug Controller General's office, get their CGMP facility approved, and now they're set up to do trials for about 120 patients. And so I think the regulatory pathways are getting well established now, and particularly the 2018, I think, revised guidelines from the Drug Controller General has laid out very clear paths, and particularly for genomic treatments and orphan disease-related pathways and so on are well specified. But it's complex, and
it's complex, yes. So especially if you're dealing with biodiversity, so you need biodiversity clearance, you need pollution board clearance, you need a DBT clearance if you're working with recombinant DNA, like CRISPR-Cas9, you need special clearance for that.
Sure. Yeah. So all of that, but they're all getting streamlined, and and at least there are documents you can consult, and there are consultants who will help you through. So so that's thank you for that response, and so maybe we can move on to another question, Rupan.
Yeah. So the next question is for Anirban.
Yeah.
Anirban, what does your TB analytics platform entail, and how you benchmark its performance?
Right. So the TB analytics platform, I think Dr. Chandru got this spot on, is based on a broader metagenomic analytical framework. On the output scale, the TB analytics platform right now, the place where we are doing about 17 antibiotics in one test. And that's all automated. So basically, you can take a raw sequence file and put it on the software. click a button and it gives you the drug resistance profiles for 17 antibiotics. We are very close to putting pretonamide on the table as well. We've not yet validated it. And the way we go about it is one, of course, WHO is very, very helpful with the kind of catalogs they bring out. So that is helpful. Most of the genomic validation is based around quality control. So that helps us benchmark against pipelines such as the WHO's own pipelines on reseq, TB, and so on and so forth. What also we are able to add a tremendous value is on the identification of mutations. That's what I was talking about. When we start building phylogenetic trees of 10,000, 15,000 tuberculosis isolates, we have a very clear understanding of the cladonistic development of these mutations. And then we start to dissociate from validating a mutation with a phenotypic test, which traditionally we did, and then we get into predicting mutations. And till the regulatory changes, every such mutation we will have to go ahead and possibly validate on a phenotypic test. So as of now, we have 17 anti-TB drugs which we test on the platform, and we were very, very lucky to get WHO Central TB Division very early on with us, and we did the first validation at JJ Hospital, and yeah, that's where we are at tuberculosis. We have obviously moved further ahead into the infectious disease spectrum.
Thank you.
Just a little bit more maybe. So we are now moving into, we did a couple of more work with some of the other key opinion leaders, such as Hinduja Hospital, and now we are talking with some diagnostic labs as well. Again, this is, as has been laid out by Kannan and Anand, it's a slow process, but the good thing is we are not going back, we're going forward. So we're going from 10,000 to 10,100 to 10,500, and we are moving ahead.
Thank you. Next one, Rupan. Yeah.
Question from Senthil, and it probably is open to all kinds of questions about how is the investment sentiment towards synthetic biology segment, which is more or less nascent, like biofabrication, and how do you see the contribution of this field into India's bioeconomy, and do you expect this to grow soon? Dr. Chandru, you may want to take this, and then someone else can chime in.
So synthetic biology, right? So investor sentiment, I think, you guys can probably talk a little bit more about it, but I think, we are at a very exciting point, and I think Anand and I, helped to curate the Bangalore Tech Summit, where we had some incredible talks on synthetic biology by some of the founders like Jim Collins and George Church, and it's clear that very exciting days ahead. And I actually call this the start of the age of living machines, right? And I think clearly this name has come from MIT, where they even have an undergraduate program now on living machines as part of their NEET program. And I think and in some ways gene editing is sort of the edge of synthetic biology, but I think the World Economic Forum, in its listing of the 10 largest breakthrough technologies in sight in 2020, one of the 10 is on building synthetic genomes, right? So I think it's certainly something that is that's very exciting, and not just for human health. I mean, if you just look at human health and genomic medicines, Goldman Sachs has put the value at about $4.8 trillion. This was in their 2018 projection. But if you go beyond human health, and that's the beauty of the age of living machines is that we will be looking at industrial applications, and including fuel and cleaning of the environment. There's lots and lots of wonderful applications that synthetic biology opens up. So I would imagine that the investor interest will build up. As always, I think in many aspects of life sciences work, we'll have to see probably public funding provide the initial seed, and I think DBT has been leading a lot of discussion around synthetic biology and gene editing, and we have just finished reviewing the detailed project report for genomics for the national mission on genomics and human health. But I think there's also a national mission on biodiversity and human well-being, and in that there is a lot of emphasis also on genomics with the Earth Biogenome Project and various other genomic projects. But synthetic biology, I think, is still at the stage where there are committees that are meeting and discussing how the DBT should take it forward, and I think we'll probably see the first move there, and then possibly some of the early venture funds and so on that can look at start looking at the business models that make sense. But that's the stage broadly that we are at. It's going through the roof in Boston and places like that.
Really?
But yeah, but I think it'll take a little while to get here.
Rajat, you want to add something?
Yeah. So I mean, again, it's very, very early days here in India. I can vouch for this, right? I mean, this panel is also interesting, and I'm just not talking about synthetic biology, but genomics and deep tech in general, right? I mean, this panel is interesting because I remember meeting Anand in 2007, Cellworks. Okay, I remember sitting with Dr. Kannan in a coffee shop in Hyderabad, 2015, and just couldn't take any of these conversations forward, right? And so I can say with authority here that it's simply because investors here do not understand this space, right? And so it's very, very difficult. I mean, if you just look at the numbers, right? In India, I think the last 4 or 5 years, I think the $360 million have gone into this space. A handful of companies, we have MedGenome, MapMyGenome, and Strand here. A bunch of companies, very few companies that have actually been able to raise any significant amount of capital, and it really comes down to not from an intent perspective, but really understanding of the space, which is a real challenge. I mean, even if you look at bioengineering, I think there are a couple of companies that are trying to 3D print liver parts, and so it's not that it's not happening, but really the investor understanding of this space is fairly limited, and so that I think is a challenge, right? Compared to $1 billion that goes every year into VC funding for the last 5 years, if only $350 million has gone into this space, you can imagine how much capital that is there. And the other thing is also Chandru, on the funding piece about flipping companies, right? I mean, we've got in our own portfolio companies that we have flipped into the US, right? Simply because the supply chain of capital is just not there, right? So it's a fantastic infrastructure, very, very early with DBT, BIRAC, CCAMP, all of these. I mean, you can really get it to a certain level, and when you really need the money, there could be a few funds like ourselves, Bloom is there, who possibly will do a Series A. But really, when you really need the large, checks to come in, when you are there at a position where you can really, start showing something, that's when you really find supply chain of capital being limited. And then to get investors from outside the country, from the US, to come in and look at investing into a company in India, all of this becomes extremely complicated. The other thing what we've also seen is that when we talk to people who are potential acquirers in these businesses, right, or partners, IP becomes a problem. They're not convinced that holding an IP here is as good as holding an IP in India. So there are multiple challenges, right? That when we've funded companies, we've actually asked them to flip it to the US, right? We've spoken to Anand multiple times on this, and I really think there should be a few successes that needs to come out, right? Which in this space takes time, unfortunately, right? And once you have some elements of success that are there, and hopefully, with Anand and a few of these folks around here and other companies that are there, if you're able to show that, you will, even though understanding is limited, the fact that money can be made, will drive investments. Sure. And so that's the way I think I see this going forward.
All right. Well,
if I may just chime, thank you, Ranjit. You captured the whole investor horizon well. But on the question that Arpit posed to us, synthetic biology, Arpit, actually, again, just like how genomics was an inflection where technology, mathematics, computer science, and biology came together, we are like that with synthetic biology. But we have a huge problem in our country, which is the National Biodiversity Act. It's actually a deterrent because, as Arpit, you know very well, we are funded by Japanese investors and South African investors, thanks to UTech. They did look at some synthetic biology companies, and because of Biodiversity Act and the fear that IP somehow is not strong here, that's a fear. Maybe not fully, it's maybe an unfounded fear, but it's there. They didn't invest. And this Biodiversity Act almost makes it impossible for you to take $1 from someone who's not an Indian citizen, not even an OCI, Indian citizen. So Chandru and I work on ABLE. One of the biggest things we want to pull off in 2021 is to be able to convince, Delhi and potentially have a change, a parliament change. It has to be an act to change the Biodiversity Act. Once the Biodiversity Act changes to where free flow of capital can happen and this sensitivity that you can't have a single dollar with a non-Indian, etc., moves out, I think that could potentially become the next inflection in synthetic biology. It won't solve all the problems of funding that Ranjit so nicely espoused, but I think that's a potential pivot in 2021, we hope.
Right.
Anyone else?
While we're talking, right, I'm sorry. Sorry.
Dr. Please continue. Yeah, please continue.
Just wanted to quickly, Ranjit, I really liked what you were talking about, how we need at least 1 or 2 success stories. And my question to you in that context would be, give me 2 or 3 metrics that you would evaluate. Like, what do you think a success story would like? Would it be a startup who's successfully able to get a Series A and then go scale massively? What would be your 2 or 3 top metrics if you were into hypothetically say that this one startup or these 2 startups would be ideal in this context?
See, there are two elements of success, right? One is, of course, from the company side, building a product, taking it to market and partnerships, so depending on how you try to do it. But from an investor standpoint, really success is actually, money coming back, right? So that clearly defines a success of an investment. I mean, which is nothing to do with, and within a particular time frame. See, this is also important because these are all closed-ended funds. You've got a 10-year cycle, investment cycle. So that is what I mean by saying that, if you see them, a few of these investments panning out. And when I say this in India, I mean, forget genomics and biotech and biomaterials and stuff. In general, exits have been tough, right? It's only in the recent few years that exits have come out, even in your sectors such as e-commerce and software and stuff like that. And add to the complexity of regulatory compliances and stuff, the risk just goes up and the exit timelines that much more longer, which makes it challenging from an investor standpoint. So success from our side would be that money coming back, which will happen. I mean, it is very visible. I mean, when you talk to some of these folks, right, it is clearly visible both on the company side as well as when you talk to potential acquirers. They will list out a bunch of companies that are there in India that are doing extremely very, very good work, very interested. Right? It's just the amount of data that they require, and the timelines for this just keep extending over a period of time, which makes it complicated.
Right. I just want to change topic for a bit here and get Prapti to come back and tell us a little bit about how this whole thing with the Illumina accelerator worked, and perhaps some of the audience would like to know more about that. Huh?
Most definitely.
Yeah.
So we, like true academicians, realized we needed money to build this. Where do we get money? We apply for grants. We look all over the internet. We do research to find out our resources. We stumbled upon the Illumina Accelerator just by doing some research. We applied and got through, luckily, with only the second Indian company that's been on it. So they have the Illumina Accelerator in San Francisco as well as in Cambridge. It's for 6 months, they incubate companies. They give you some amount of investment upfront and sequencing credits. And it's been a really useful time span. Unfortunately, we couldn't actually physically go there because of the pandemic. But I think we just made the most of the situation, work with it remotely, and it's helped us really chisel out the technology, the uses, and the applications, better articulate our value proposition, how we're going to better articulate the business strategy, how we will monetize everything. So it's really helped that in that context, in addition to the sequencing credits, which in a regular Indian startup context, we'd be fundraising or getting through BIRAC. So the scale kind of changes simply because we are backed by those guys. So we get a technology backing, we get a business kind of backing. So it's just a very topical startup incubator for a very niche space, and it made perfect sense for us to be working with them for that, and we have amazing backing from the folks. I'm happy to share.
You're connected with the one at QB3 at UCSF or the one in Oxford?
Yes. Foster City in UCSF, yeah.
In UCSF, okay. Oh, it's in Foster City now. It used to be.
It's actually
at UCSF.
So the UCSF, right? So they have the bigger thing in San Francisco. So now it's the big complex is in Foster City. As far as I know, I haven't been. It's all virtual.
Yeah, I was there when it was set up at
awesome
at QB3, and
yeah, and we have. It's really exciting because Mustafa, who is the founder of the CSO. And he was the CTO. Yeah, he's the CTO now. Alex has taken over. We get monthly meetings with them to really chart out and brainstorm. So it's very, very useful for a young company like ours to grow and build.
Absolutely. That's a great perspective, Prapti. I just want to add, Dr. Chandru, one point about fundability of startups. Aligned with both what Ranjit and Anand said. What we are realizing more and more is that although the time to market is also slower in India, the market size also tends to be smaller, which is why funds like ours are not able to invest into genomics and biology companies. We have tried hard, but it is very hard to justify an investment unless you have global markets in your purview.
Okay. So that's a good pointer to some of the entrepreneurs in the panel and in the audience. I think we're at 6:30. I just wanted to do a time check on should we wrap up or are we?
We have one more question. Let us take this question, which is somewhat of a open nature, and I also see Satya Das has joined, so we would definitely want to hear from him. This question is open-ended and asked from Anand. What Dr. Ashwini Agarwal is asking: Do you believe we have a good ecosystem? So I guess we are talking about what defines good ecosystem, and tell us your opinion if it was otherwise, and then maybe all the panelists can chime in.
I'm sure. Yeah. So, good ecosystem is a relative term, right? It all comes from where we started in the 2000s. Some of us had struggled to find reagents and lab supplies and good scientists. Today, we have excellent talent pool. We have these fabulous incubators from across the country. We keep talking about BBC and CCamp, IKP, because they are here. But we have some fantastic accelerators, which DBT has co-funded. That's what I meant by ecosystem, right? The ability to go talk to some companies who have at least a 7 to 10 year history, who have done some things right, who have done some things wrong. The ability to talk to founders who didn't exist. Biotech founders is a new breed, right? Who have, as I said, learned from their experience, work in these accelerators, incubators, so you get access to platform technologies. So you can be really capital light. So I take Bugworks as an example. Would you all believe it? Except for our laptops and cell phones, we have no CapEx because we work up multiple accelerators in the US, UK, and Bangalore. I can't imagine doing a drug discovery company and you say you have no CapEx. That's the ecosystem I'm talking about. What is missing in the ecosystem are success stories, like Ranjit said, right? I never blame investors because I've been slapped by all investors, and I can't blame them because they just say, please show me a few successes that have exited in 7-10 years and given 3x, 4x return. So the capital, which becomes a real problem as you start moving into that Series A ramp up, to me is the only missing piece. And Arpit, I want to finish up with a very positive outlook that I think post-COVID, there's going to be a deeper appreciation for health technologies, deep science. And some of these funds are going to become blended funds, where at least 10 to 20% of the fund allocation can be for impact investment. So it's my hope. Some of it is wishful thinking. Some of it is just seeing what's happening out there. The 21-22 will see more impact investors coming in. We need those long gestation impact investors. So the piece that's missing in ecosystem is M&As, exits, licensing deals, that whole exit success stories. And therefore, the lack of capital to allow us to move out of this grant-based mentality to equity-based orbits.
So Anand, I mean, just to supplement, right? I mean, the other thing that we are seeing in the last few years is most funds have this, focus around deep tech, right? And the realization there is that it will take longer, right? So you will see a lot more, funds opening up a lot more to doing some of these things because they put this into the deep tech bucket that they do, right? Okay. And because interestingly, I mean, it's from a selfish interest perspective, right? Even the LPs are also interested in understanding what you're doing with deep tech. So, right? So you will have funds that are more open to doing deep tech stuff. Now looking at these sectors a little differently, right? Which will drive some changes, right? Obviously, everything will not be solved by tomorrow, but I think you will see a lot more stuff. And I can tell you from our standpoint, we have a sector in Fund 4 which is really focused on deep tech, right? So we will be far more, open to doing some of this, even though we don't understand, because of the fact that, there is an opportunity here. And also it's a problem on the ground that needs to be solved.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Anand, I'd like to just come in here on this part on ecosystem. And this is again a personal story. I was just writing to Anand. To answer the question, an ecosystem is only as good as you reach out to. And that is very, very important. And when we are doing deep tech, we are scientists. We are always looking inwards. We are not looking outwards. So Haystack started like with conversations. There was a conversation with Anand in the ABLE meeting in Bangalore. And I was still a scientist at IIT Bombay. And he was coming out. He gave this usual amazing lecture. He was coming out. I just got hold of him and said, Anand, this genomics for TB and diagnostics, we're doing this and that. Do you think it's a research thing or it's a commercial thing? He just looked at me and said, commercial thing. And he left. And since then, I started thinking, okay, what does he mean? And how do we take across? And then we started talking to other people. I mean, when you're talking to Sign, when you're talking to CCAM, there are amazing people in the ecosystem who will handhold you. I still think there is a big gap when we go from proof of concept to a market rollout. There requires a lot amount of capital infusion. But at least I had a few investor conversations. What I see is that from the investor, the intent is on the table. Now, it is up to the entrepreneur to be able to connect to that intent. Now, I also know that at certain point, we will definitely have to look abroad because that quantum of fund, as we were discussing right now, there's a quantum of fund which will come from outside. But for somebody who is starting up, I think the ecosystem is here. There are people like, there are scientists in IGIV, there is IIT, there are all of these people. There is Anand, there is Chandru, all of them. We just need to reach out and try our best to solve the problem. And that is what is important.
Very good.
I think there was one question I had marked it for live answering. It got pushed into the other section. Shall I read it out?
Please.
Yeah. So someone is asking, what are some of the computational challenges that are needed for research community to ease the translation of research to clinical applications? So basically, this is what we call as bench to bedside. It's never been easier. So one of the lessons that we have learned in our personal entrepreneurial journey, the sooner you get into the hospital, the sooner you go and meet the doctors, it's better. So even in other business models, you should get into that clinical immersion. Face the customers as early as possible. So we had to go through several iterations, refining our model. So the most recent iteration we have done is instead of positioning it as a monitoring and as a disease monitoring test, we are positioning it as a companion diagnostic test. So the doctors in India are very comfortable to use the liquid biopsy as a companion diagnostics.
So very good, thank you. And I think there's a lot of requests for Satya to speak up or say something or ask a question. So yeah, Satya, please go ahead. Maybe he would
Satya,
just.
hi, we would love to hear from you about the panel.
Is he on, Arpit?
He's a panelist now. Satya, I'm not sure if you can hear us. If you can.
He's on mute. Satya, you're on mute.
Yes, some other time.
Hello, Anand?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear it.
We would love to
we
hear
just
from
wanted
you
your
about
Gyan, I think. Right?
Yeah. Satya, special comments from Satya.
That is a moment I wish I could record that. Anand and Vijay asking me for Gyan.
This is getting recorded, so you can play back.
That is a moment for me. Anyway, thank you, Vijay. Thank you, Anand. Thank you, everyone else. It was really good to hear. I think sitting in Berlin, let me just say what happened. So since last, and just indulge me for a couple of more minutes. So last year, I started doing bit of consulting with Nesta Longitude Prize. Oh, this is being recorded. Okay. So, and as you know, Longitude Prize is on antimicrobial resistance. I also started talking with folks in Carbex that Anand knows. But this experience exposed me to really global startups, companies, startups, SMEs, innovators from universities, from the US, from European Union, as well as in Asia, India. And what I realized, and stepping back and spent quite many hours one-on-one discussions with each of these startups, around 25, 30 of them globally. And I think the take-home message for me was this: one, in terms of the kind of innovations that we are doing, the kind of ideas that we have. We started BIG almost 8 years back. The kind of creativity, ingenuity, if you were to rank 0 to 10, do we cut it? The answer is yes. Do we have the early stage money to do it? The answer is yes. I think Anand mentioned about going beyond the grant, mindset. The idea, once you reach the clinical validation, is where I think our ecosystem is going through that molting process now, what we went through maybe 15 years back when we didn't even have any founders, right? Except for a few like Vijay here or Anand. And I think also it occurred to me by interacting with these startups that our ecosystem for manufacturing, and these are all diagnostic companies, so I'll restrict my comments to that. The design for manufacturing, the idea about when your MVP is ready to go into mass production, and the ecosystem for that as well is perhaps lacking in India. So, our vendors for cutting edge plastics molding to, making electronic components to optics, they are not there, right? And that is a big lacuna. But the fact remains that we in India have our automobile industry, right? So we know how to do precision engineering. It's not that we don't, but part of that ecosystem, if it could be somehow brought into helping our medtech biomedical ecosystem through some de-risking mechanism by the government, is perhaps my policy advice would be to the government for the next 10 years. Other than, of course, what Vijay and others and Anand touched upon about the kinds of capital we need, the kind of ecosystem we need for technology transfer. Of course, those that remain as well. But I see a big lacuna in the vendors. A lot of vendors grow with the startups, right? And we do not have that mechanism of coupling vendors with startups and vendors who can actually cut it, who know also about traceability of materials, about documentation, all of that. And when they start paying the duet with the startup, that's when they grow together. I think that ecosystem, Vijay and Anand, we need to focus. And through your insights and advice, if Niti Ayogs of the world and the PSA office and DBT, DST, CSIR, they all can come together to kind of de-risk, like we de-risk the early stages through public funding, then that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Satya. And I think, let me just mention that the Index project, which is the virtual marketplace for indigenous diagnostics, that is just getting set up at CCamp with Lalit Kishore from GE heading it, and from the PSA sort of drove that, and also the Rockefeller Foundation has funded it. It looks like that might be a good test case, and that could lead to this kind of infrastructure that you talked about, Satya, to get this connect between vendors and innovators and indigenization and innovation at all levels, right? So, for example, just the probes that were needed for COVID, other than Envir, Veneer, I don't know who else, and they were not, there wasn't that much capability in the country to actually, come up with those. But I think that's something, or, the wonderful enzyme, innovation that Debojyoti talked about, the Cas9 construct that was done indigenously. But now how, we have to systematically bring all such resources together to build the ecosystem, I think. Right? We have gone on. It's about
Vijay, can I just make a 30
Right.
second comment, Vijay?
Sure.
Another great inflection possibility for our country is we spend only 1.2% of our GDP on health, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
And now COVID has taught the whole world some really nasty lessons, and for us. The latest talk is that the next budget may have almost as high as 2.7%. So we're more than going to double the budget if it happens. So it's still a wish here. But there is a talk, Vijay, to have it somewhere close to 2.7, 2.8 in terms of spending. That's massive, relative to where we are today.
2.5 had been promised. So
yeah, so they want to hit about 2.8. They're
yeah.
still at 1.25. So, and it shows. It obviously shows, because many of the solutions that many of you are talking about, we need to sell through public health in India, particularly TB, malaria, any of the neglected diseases. Let's be honest. Private markets will be limited. We have to have a strong, vibrant public health distribution, public health purchasing. So procurement. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. So let's hope that that is going to become a reality. That will really add some tailwinds for our entire sector.
30 seconds more, Gyan, from me, Vijay and Anand, if you I think one more thing. I was writing a paper, and Vijay, thanks to you. And I'm going to want to develop this idea, and I don't want to be derogatory, but we shouldn't end up as graveyards of prototype in India. Okay. And that's a very strong phrase I'm using.
Yeah.
But that is actually the danger in the next 10 years, right? I mean, having been part of starting BIG and Sparsh and all others, that is fine. But the next level, my fear is, are we understanding the next level as much as we did 15, 20 years about seeding these, innovation? And if we really think of that strong phrase as graveyards or prototype, what else can we then do not to make a graveyard, right?
Right.
I'll stop there.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's. I'd like to thank all the panelists and the audience for this great interaction. I think we all got a lot out of it. Maybe hand it back now to Arpit and Rupan to maybe put in some final remarks and what next in the deep tech initiative. Right? So.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Chandru. So I think I would say that this has been a really insightful panel discussion. And thank you everyone for sharing your insights, your experiences. We did learn about some real challenges that building a business in this space entails, but I see a silver lining and a lot of positivity. And hopefully over next few years, we'll see times change and the ecosystem mature. So with that in mind, thanks again to the entire panel, to Dr. Chandru, as well as Satya, for chiming in with your views. So as a next step, I think we'll probably have another session, deep tech focus session, but with some other topic. And in parallel, we are also working on launching an accelerator, and we'll keep you all posted. We will be sharing a WhatsApp link for the group so that you can stay abreast with whatever is up on the anvil. So looking forward to seeing you all in the next session. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you all very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you, Dr. Chandru, for pulling it so beautifully. Thank you.
Thanks, Arpit.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.